So I know it's early in the year, but I already want to put out my best science fiction fantasy so far for 2024 because it's turning out to be an amazing year and I already have so many favorites. I have no idea how I'm going to compile my top 10s. Maybe they're going to have to turn into top 15 or top 20s if the year keeps going the way it is. And so I wanted to give you a preview of some of the books that might make the list or not, depending on what else I read this year. So if you want to hear about the best so far, let's get started. Now, I should mention I'm going to combine science fiction fantasy. Usually when I do wrap-ups, I separate into two groups, but I'm going to combine them together, although you'll notice that this list is very heavy with science fiction, as in 8 of the books are sci-fi. So the first one I want to talk about at number 10 is This Alien Shore by C.S. Friedman, and this is a sci-fi thriller that follows a young woman who is finding out more of her past. It is a book that I just found to be very engrossing, a good narrative that I just flew through the story and found myself very attached to the character, wanting to know more about it. It has some romance and some other kind of cliche tropes that normally would bother me more, but instead I found this book to be very comforting, very much, again, an easy read, which was a great blend of science fiction, but also leaning into some of the, again, thriller tropes that I normally love to read in my dark fiction content. So I ended up having a great time with this one and would definitely read more by this author. So if you have recommendations where to go next with C.S. Friedman, let me know down below because I'm definitely going to read more. Then at number 9, we have the Wandering Inn series by Pirate Abba. I'm not caught up. I will never be caught up at the time of this filming or any time in the future, but I'm continuing on reading through this series, and this book series definitely had to make the list because for reading so many pages, so many chapters and volumes, I think it says a lot about the fact that I am interested in continuing on, even though it is such a time commitment. Even for someone who reads as fast as me, it's a long series to go. So this is what I describe as a portal fantasy where you never get to see our world, but instead the story starts with the characters being transported into this secondary world. We start with Aaron, who becomes an innkeeper in order to make a living within this other world that has other fantastical creatures. Eventually the characters meet up. There are different humans from our world trying to find a place there. And it's a book series with lots of humor, but still stakes. It has some long-going character development, action, and kind of a bit of everything within this series. And it's one that I've really enjoyed so far. And for some people, they might be quite upset that this book series is not higher up on the list, and it just comes down a lot of times to preferences. It's very possible that as I read further into the book series, you might see this series get a lot higher in my final ranking at the end of the year. So far, I definitely enjoy it. It's just a fun, bingeable series, something to always come back to, something that, again, is very escapist and comforting to read. And so if you're looking for something like that, I do recommend this series for the right audience. I think that there's a reason so many people are obsessed with it. Then at number 8, we have Souls in the Great Machine by Sean McClellan. And this is one that follows a regressed society. It's set in some sort of post-apocalyptic future where our society and technology has broken down. And so they end up using the souls of individuals to fuel and power the technology of this imagined future. In terms of premise, this book is just made for me. I think it is so weird and dark and leans into the ideas and concepts that you see played around with things like The Matrix, but done a very different way. This is a book I love, but I recognize it has mixed reviews online. I can definitely see why, because while it has such an amazing concept, the execution or narrative choices of the author are perhaps just not what you would expect given what I've just described, and it just gives you a more intimate, character-driven perspective where you might want to see the larger scope of what is happening. But is the world so fascinating that I just want to know more? Absolutely. I really enjoyed my time with this chunky book. And again, if you share my weird niche taste in science fiction, I think that some of you will really love this one too. Then at number 7, we have Two Like the Lightning by Ada Palmer, which I already feel like is the wrong place for this book. I feel like it should be so much higher, but I need to reread this book and read the rest of the series before I can definitively say that. So this is a piece of literary science fiction that is set in a future that is supposedly a golden age. However, as is often the case in science fiction, nothing is quite as true as that promise seems to be. And so we follow someone who is an indentured servant and they get pulled into a larger plot. And it's a book in a series that is very distinct in terms of the narrative setup. It often breaks the fourth wall and has a particular style that just feels very different than the other science fiction I'm reading. Again, I finished the book and I liked what I read, but my enjoyment of it or appreciation from what I've read really feels dependent on getting a better understanding of the bigger picture. It's a book that I feel like I didn't get everything I wanted out of it the first time around, and I kind of want to reread it now that I know where the book goes, to see it at the beginning and the clues and hints along the way. So it's a book that I just don't feel qualified to put any higher on this list, but I have no doubt that it deserves to be much higher, and I expect that to change quite a bit once we get to the year-end rankings. Then at number 6, we have The Dark Forest by Cixin Liu, and this of course is the stand-in favorite of the trilogy for the Earth's Past Remembrance. I did a whole series review. I will link it in the cards and description if I remember. But this is my favorite of the 3 books of the trilogy. I think it is just the right blend of action, hard science fiction, and I did find the character work to be quite interesting in this middle part. I know the series is often criticized for not being character focused, but for me, this is a sweet spot where everything really came together in an exciting narrative that I found just very interesting, ideas that really expanded upon ideas that perhaps I already knew, but giving me different insight or reflecting back on things that I hadn't given a whole lot of thought to before. And so I really like this one. It really, for me, opened my eyes to why everyone loved the series so much. Don't get me wrong, I still think that Death's End is a great conclusion. And now that I know the full picture of it, I have a lot more appreciation and love for the first book, Three Body Problem, which, as I said in my video, almost feels like a prologue. So I'm going to put this book in as the standout, but really this is a placement for the whole trilogy of Earth's Past Remembrance. We'll go here at number 6, which again might be horribly low for some of you, and perhaps for others might be way too high. So I'd love to know your thoughts on this series and how you feel about my ranking so far. Now breaking into the number 5 spot, we have Denial by John Raymond, and this is set in a somewhat near future, imagining a future where the environment has further broken down due to effects of climate change. And so we see a world that is not actually in a state of kind of post-apocalyptic decay as it's often imagined, but instead just seeing things extrapolated from where they are now and the adjustments that the average person has made in their life in order to try to mitigate or at least lessen their effect or footprint on the earth. And so we follow someone who works as a journalist, and they in their work are trying to track down someone who has been accused of these great environmental crimes that have gone into hiding because of all the corporate greed that they caused that led to different environmental outcomes. And so they track this person down. And the interesting part with this book is that it explores the topic of those that make environmental choices that are negative in a very strangely nuanced way that I would not have expected. So I think often people are turned off by climate change fiction because it can be so heavy-handed and so supposedly judgmental and very much on the nose and black and white. And instead this book was really interesting, and what I loved is again the fact that it was basically playing a devil's advocate. So this journalist meets this man, and he's not the evil villain that he is expected to be, and instead is a well-rounded, dynamic person. And this book definitely is meant to discuss climate change, but I think it's great because I think it is more welcoming for those that have mixed feelings about changing their ways and footprint and all of that, and does it in a way that I think again just challenges beliefs and takes the judgment out of it. I think instead it just has a really honest conversation about where the world might be headed and what we are potentially giving to the next generation if we continue on our way, but in a way again that I think will really appeal to a lot of readers that have otherwise been shying away from climate change fiction. I love it. It's just something that I find really interesting to read about if you follow my channel, but I do think this is one that I can widely recommend to a whole range of readers, and I hope that you will love it as much as I did. Then at number 4, we have Ball Lightning by Cixin Liu, the same author, of course, who wrote The Three Body Problem. This is a standalone, although somewhat of a prequel, very loosely to that trilogy. And so in the story, we follow a young man who at the beginning of the story, his parents die due to this horrific ball lightning, and then they decide to commit their whole life to studying this phenomenon. And then we follow them as an adult and the consequences of what comes afterwards. I love this story. There's something almost intangible about the feelings I have towards this book. I just had a feeling of joy reading it. It has a wonderful coming of age narrative, that loss of innocence that I love so much often in my dark fiction brought into a science fiction narrative. It deals with hard science fiction ideas in a way that felt very exploratory and just made me very curious for the world and the phenomenon, and looking to see what in the story is real versus fiction and fact, and exploring all of that. And so if you're looking for something that will make you excited about science, if you were someone like me that, again, doesn't have a science background, I don't work in a science field in my job, but just loves the idea of the world around us, nature, space, and everything else that is out there, this is the kind of book that makes me fall back in love with science fiction over and over again. So for whatever reason, this book just captured everything I love about the genre, and I highly recommend it. If you haven't read it yet, it is so worth your time, and I hope you love it too. Then at number 3, we have 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami, and this is the only other fantasy book on this list. This one follows a few different perspectives. We follow a young woman who is in a taxi, ends up going down this rabbit hole into another version of our world. It appears to be like our world, but not quite. And so she's trying to piece together what happened. We also have this other perspective of this writer who takes on a job to help ghostwrite this young woman's work, and their stories eventually intertwine. It is an epic story in nature. It blends into multi-universe theory and other dystopian ideas, and so it really does blend genres, which is probably why I like it so much. I'm always a fan of things that kind of play around with a multiverse in general, even if it's done in more of a magical realism type of way rather than a science fiction background to the story. And I just love the setup of this one. The first section, easily 5 stars. This is a story that I eventually want to do a standalone review for because I have so many feelings about it. I have complicated feelings towards some of the adult subject matter that is treated very strangely in the book, but taking those elements out of account, the actual story that is told, the narrative, the idea and premise behind the story is something that I adore. It's a story that haunts me, one that I constantly think about, and that for me is a tried and true test of a really good book, and one that I would love to recommend widely to everyone, except for the fact, again, that there is some strange subject matter that is definitely going to make it less appealing to certain readers. Again, I will come back at some point with a full review giving you more of my thoughts on this one, but as a personal favorite of mine, I love it despite the things that I don't, and I hope that you can understand and have a similar book perhaps that you have mixed feelings about but adore it anyways. Then at number 2, we have Electric Forest by Tanith Lee. This is a science fiction story that follows a young woman who is disabled. However, she gets the opportunity to go into a new body in agreement to do this espionage plot that she is pulled into. So it's a story full of political intrigue, very much a character story, heavy with relationship back and forth. A lot of interesting conversations and themes surrounding a person's body and treatment and respect within the world. There are layers to the story, and it was a very interesting ride. I didn't really know where it was going, but it's a one that was recommended to me by my good friend Whitney at Secret of Storycraft, and my goodness, she promised me a fantastic ending, and she is not wrong. It's easily one of the best endings I've read in a science fiction book. It's a kind of book that just makes you reframe the whole story, one that makes you want to reread it, often multiple times, which is what I've done at this point, and so I do recommend it. It's brilliant, it's out of the box, and in my opinion, it is definitely underhyped, at least here on YouTube, and I'd really like to change that. And last at the number 1 spot, we have The Wandering Earth by Cixin Liu. Yes, this is basically the video where I gush about all of his books, but this is surprisingly my favorite out of everything I've read this year by him, which is surprising because of the fact that it is a short story collection, and if you follow my channel, you'll know that I do tend to have a very strong preference for a longer form work. Often I say that short stories just don't have enough meat to them in order to hook me in, or at least to have a lasting impression. However, his stories are clearly the exception. I cannot stop thinking about this collection. There are multiple stories that I adore. The first story is the one with the title and follows an idea where rather than us leaving the earth, we take the earth with us to another place and continue our life there. And it's such an imaginative, out of the box way that is so different than the stories that always involve humanity getting on a rocket ship and going to another planet. Instead, we take the planet with us along the way, which I love. And it's such an interesting story, but it's not the only strong story in the collection. In fact, nearly every story within the collection I found to be interesting, having different ideas and themes, and explore different concepts that made me reevaluate or rethink about things that I had otherwise not thought about before, or even if I had, think about them in entirely different ways. Just like with the Remembrance Earth trilogy, this short story collection collection plays a lot with the end of the world and different imagining of different hard science fiction concepts. And again, there was story after story that I loved. One of these stories is very meta, and the author may have made an appearance themselves in there in a way that I just thought was so creative, so fun. And if you can't tell, I adore this short story collection. And again, I always say I don't love short stories. I don't read them. I don't review them on my channel very often, but clearly I need to change that. So if you have another standout science fiction or fantasy collection that you think I need to read, let me know down below, because I am pretty obsessed with this one. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And as well, let me know what is the best backlist science fiction or fantasy that you have read this year, meaning books published before 2024. If I haven't read them, I will definitely check them out, and maybe they'll make my end of the year list. So if you're new here and want to stick around, subscribe. I hope you do. You can also hit that little notification button so you never miss a video from me. If you want to let me know you're here, I appreciate even a thumbs up or a comment, even if it's just a little emoji. And otherwise, I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.